In July 2003, I boarded a flight from Bangkok to Yangon, the capital of Myanmar. It was a short flight, but it soon felt like an eternity. From takeoff to landing, the plane rocked violently from side to side with sudden drops that took me back to the terrifying roller coasters of my youth. You know how they say that if turbulence on a plane makes you nervous, then you should take comfort in the calm demeanors of the flight attendants? Well, that didn't work this time, for they were clearly scared too. And no wonder, seeing the snack cart rumble across the aisle and crash into the wall. Now eventually we landed, of course, and none of us were any worse for the wear. Back then, I was just a 20-something-year-old backpacker, eager to get off the beaten track, and barely knew anything about Myanmar, a diverse, largely Buddhist nation of 55 million people. But now, having studied Asia for the past 2 decades, I wish I could go back and give my younger self some advice. Namely, don't fly to Myanmar during the height of the monsoon season. From June to October, the region around Yangon gets a whopping 183 inches of rain. By comparison, my famously rainy hometown of Seattle gets less than 40 inches of rain spread throughout the entire year. Now I should qualify that a little though. Don't fly to Yangon during the rainy season. Yangon is in lower Myanmar, along the coast. But your odds of having a pleasant flight increase dramatically if you fly to the ancient capital of Bagan in upper Myanmar. Here, shielded from the coastal monsoons, the parched plains receive only about 1/3 of the amount of rain of their southern counterparts. And for several hundred years, from the 11th to the 13th centuries AD, Bagan was the flourishing capital of one of the first Buddhist kingdoms in Southeast Asia. At about the same time that the Khmer kings were building their magnificent Hindu temples in and around Angkor, the Burmese monarchs of Bagan were patronizing the construction of thousands of Buddhist temples, stupas, and monasteries, nearly all of which can still be seen today. Now, in recognition of its seminal role in the history of Southeast Asia, Bagan was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019. Today, the densely populated city of Yangon tends to form every traveler's first impression of Myanmar. But this wasn't always the case. In 1886, the British incorporated the land that they called Burma into their South Asian empire and made Yangon its colonial capital. But this actually represented a seismic shift in the political center of gravity. For some 2,000 years before the British ever arrived on the scene, the wet maritime coast of lower Myanmar consisted of little more than sleepy fishing villages punctuated by mangrove swamps not very well suited for intensive agriculture. Instead, economic wealth and political power had nearly always been concentrated in the dry zone of upper Myanmar, some 400 miles to the north. This was the country's rice basket, where most of its population lived. But how does a dry zone become a rice basket? It all comes down to geography. The chief river of Myanmar is the Irrawaddy, which flows the length of the country south from Himalayan glaciers. As it winds down towards the Andaman Sea, it is fed by more rivers that emerge from high mountain ranges on its western and eastern flanks. Together, these mountains enclose the Irrawaddy River Valley and serve to protect it from outside invaders. It also facilitated the formation of a relatively homogeneous ethnic group, the Burmese, who today constitute about 2/3 of the total population of Myanmar. But this doesn't mean that Bagan was isolated. Thanks to the Irrawaddy River, it took only 5 days to journey downstream to the distant coast and the cosmopolitan influences of the maritime world. Now, the flat plains of the Irrawaddy River Valley were extremely fertile and could support a dense sedentary population, though not because of the inherent fertility of the surroundings. In fact, one ancient inscription refers to this region as Tada Desa, a Pali word meaning the country of parched earth. And make no mistake, Bagan is hot. For half the year, daily temperatures regularly climb up into the 90s or even the low 100s. In lieu of abundant rainfall, the early inhabitants of Bagan managed to harness the irrigation potential of the Irrawaddy and its tributaries by digging a web of canals that fed into the plains. The combination of reliable heat and irrigated fields made it possible to reap 2 harvests of wet rice crop every single year. So, blessed by geography, the Irrawaddy River Valley would eventually form the backdrop for several royal capitals in the millennium preceding the arrival of the British. In 2005, when the government of Myanmar relocated the current capital from Yangon to a newly built city called Naypyidaw, it actually marked a return to the age-old political traditions of the Burmese heartland. Now, the first of those royal capitals, Bagan, was founded in 849 AD on the east side of a bend in the Irrawaddy. Though it started as a small settlement, the ruling Bagan dynasty would expand its reach over the next 2 centuries to encompass the various regions that constitute modern-day Myanmar. More than 1,000 inscriptions in Old Burmese attest to Bagan's swift expansion and its vigorous patronage of Buddhist religious monuments. Now, the specific form of Buddhism practiced in Bagan was an import from Sri Lanka, which preserved the Buddhist canon in Pali, a language related to Sanskrit. Today, while visiting some of the more famous temples at Bagan, you can often hear Pali incantations played over a loudspeaker to enhance the sanctity of the atmosphere. Now, one thing that any successful religion must be able to do is to naturalize its presence wherever it takes root. And while all the important events of the Buddha's life may have occurred in what is now northern India and Nepal, fresh converts in distant lands can still find a way to claim part of the Buddha for themselves. In Myanmar, this took the form of a popular legend that said that the Buddha gave several strands of his hair to 2 Burmese merchants who had offered him food on the last day of his 7-week ordeal at the sacred site of Bodh Gaya. These strands of hair were then brought back to Myanmar and placed inside the Shwedagon Pagoda in Yangon. Today, the Shwedagon Pagoda is Myanmar's most famous and sacred site, and it showcases many of the chief visual features of Buddhism that we'll also see in the monuments of Bagan. The most obvious is the stupa itself. Traditionally, a half-dome sphere rising from a rectangular base, stupas are designed to symbolize the Buddha's presence after his death. Now, originally, this was achieved by placing a sacred relic, such as the Buddha's knucklebone, inside the inner core. Over time, though, these sacred relics could be anything even tangentially associated with the Buddha or with his disciples, or even just valuable treasures from the local community of worshippers. As Buddhist pilgrims walked around the stupa in a clockwise direction, they would reflect on the moral lessons of the Buddha's life as told through sculpted tablets and paintings. Now, stupas evolved architecturally as Buddhism spread to other cultures. In Myanmar, stupas became gilded and capped with an elaborate finial, of which Shwedagon is one of the oldest and most prominent examples. Soon, other ornate stupas appeared, driven by a rush of patronage from Burmese monarchs and other wealthy elites. In exchange for providing funds for the construction and decoration of stupas, temples, and monasteries, the Buddhist Church would bestow positive karmic merit on these important public figures, a form of spiritual capital that ensured a better rebirth in the next life. In fact, Buddhist kings were often said to derive their right to rule from all of the positive karma that they had accumulated over many previous lives filled with virtuous behavior. And though most of this art and architecture commemorates admirable ideals, liberation from material cravings, charity for the downtrodden, Buddhism would never have appealed to so many monarchs if it didn't have some way of condoning military conquest in the name of spreading the one and only true faith. We can find no better reminder of this than in the original Pali name for the town of Bagan, Arimadanapura, which means city of the crusher of enemies. From the 11th to 13th centuries AD, The royal capital of a now mighty Bagan Empire also served as the urban anchor for a religious landscape that would become dotted with nearly 3,000 Buddhist monuments. It is estimated that during the heyday of Bagan, hardly a single week would have passed by without the breaking of ground for a new stupa, temple, or monastery. This was the treasury of karmic merit on which Bagan's rulers constantly deposited. And we can begin our tour with the town itself. Though the entire religious landscape of Bagan encompasses some 16 square miles in total, the area within the walled town is tiny, no more than half a square mile. Today, the only surviving portion of the old city wall is the Taraba Gate on the eastern flank. Though the upper portion is now gone, you can still see portions of the barrel vault that once covered the passage through the gate, along with faint impressions of an ancient moat. 2 brick shrines now guard the approach, both of which were added in the late 18th or early 19th centuries. Inside, you will find what are known as nat figures, indigenous Burmese spirits, likely based on semi-historical figures who tended to perish in gruesome ways. Many Burmese continue to present these nats with various offerings in exchange for worldly favors, a reminder of the flexibility of Buddhism in incorporating local deities in new lands. Now, in addition to the wall, the ancient town was also protected by a moat, the remains of which are just barely visible in a few places. Together, they are a reminder that the walled city was likely the exclusive preserve of the royal court and other privileged elites. It shouldn't surprise us, then, to find that several exquisite examples of Buddhist architecture were built in and around the immediate environs of the walls. We don't have to go far to find an example. Close to the old city is Tat Binyu Temple, the tallest Buddhist temple in all of Bagan. Its 5 stories rise to the height of a modern 21-floor office building. From the top, you can see an incredible panorama that makes you appreciate the wonders of this site, with the spires of dozens of temples rising up from the dry scrublands as far as you can see. The name of the temple, Tat Binyu, is a Pali phrase meaning the omniscient one, a reference to the historical Buddha. This is one of the chief temples of Bagan. Completed around 1150 AD, the architecture has several key features that we'll see in many of the temples of Bagan. There are 2 main masses, a large base and a smaller central tower, covered in white stucco. They are topped by a series of terraces, 7 in all. Each terrace has little stupas at the corners. And at the summit, there is a masonry tower called a sikhara, meaning mountain in Sanskrit. These are a feature of Hindu temples across India as well. Unlike Hindu temples, though, on the very top is an umbrella finial. This is known as a T, and it's an iconic element of Burmese design. Ts were placed in special ceremonies because historically umbrellas were a revered symbol of authority and status, and their possession was strictly regulated. White umbrellas were part of the coronation regalia for the Burmese kings, but those on temples were often made of gold, and some were even inset with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. The Tat Binyu complex was not just a place of worship, but also home to a monastery and a library as well. The interior is light and airy, but spare compared to some others. Only a few of the original frescoes have survived. And while the Buddhist temples of Bagan nearly always culminate in a grand statue of the Buddha located at the end of an enclosed hallway in a publicly accessible inner sanctum near the center, the Tat Binyu temple is unique in placing its prize Buddha on the 2nd floor facing east. Most of these showpiece statues placed around the temple were originally built from brick, covered in stucco, and then painted. The few that were built from stone or metal were long ago removed to various museums within Myanmar. Most statues that you can see today are modern replicas, made of wood or metal sheets and gilded in gold. The statue placed on the upper floor of the Tat Binyu is posed in what is perhaps the most common gesture in Asian Buddhism. This is the earth-touching gesture, when the historical Buddha finally vanquished the demons of Mara and all their worldly temptations. He did this by asking the Earth Goddess to confirm his accumulated karmic merit of previous lives, and thus stake his claim to the plot of earth underneath the Bodhi tree where he attained liberation from samsara, the endless cycle of suffering and death. Inspired Burmese worshippers did not have to go on a pilgrimage all the way to India to see the Mahai Bodhi, which was the temple complex in which the descendant of the Bodhi tree stands. Because just a stone's throw away from Thap Binu stands Bagan's own Mahai Bodhi temple, similar in most respects except for the Burmese T atop its spires. This was the sort of rousing spiritual landscape that inspired worshippers of all social classes to donate their wealth for the upkeep of the temples here. In fact, on the walls of one of the side halls of the Thap Binu, there's an inscription added by a 19th century Burmese queen. In it, she mentions her visit to the temple and her donation of funds for the repair of damaged stucco, before concluding with the hope that her donation will be sufficient to sustain the temple until the appearance of Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, in about 5,000 years. Now, not all monarchs left their mark on Bagan in such a gentle and enlightened way. If we venture just a little bit south of Thap Binu, we'll reach the Damayangi Temple, which almost looks like a step pyramid. By volume and dimensions, it's actually the largest temple in Bagan. Winding round its moldering terraces, we find incredible brickwork, masonry arches, and windows, and some of the most elaborate and finely crafted doorways in Bagan. But you'll soon discover that most of them lead to nowhere, and the interior is bricked off, with only a few porches and outer corridors accessible. The reason probably has a lot to do with the man who built it, King Narathu. According to Burmese chronicles, Narathu came to the throne violently. In 1167, he murdered both his father the king and his elder brother so that he would be next in line to inherit. That construction on Damayangi started almost immediately after his bloody accession might be a sign that Narathu felt he had depleted his karmic merit and needed a particularly large stupa to atone for his sins. Or perhaps it's an expression of a tyrant who wanted to solidify his rule over Bagan with the biggest temple yet. Whatever the reason, it didn't work out. Narathu was assassinated just 3 years after taking over, and construction on the temple ceased, leaving it in its incomplete state. Before we stray too far from old Bagan, let's take a look at an important but unassuming structure, the Nakwi Ndang Stupa, just south of the urban center. Most stupas at Bagan consist of a dome-shaped base that transitions into a series of closely spaced brick rings. The Nakwi Ndang Stupa may not look like much at first glance, but it is in fact unique in having a more bulbous shape. To achieve that, each layer of bricks would have required precise modifications to the curved mold from which they were fired. One slight miscalculation, and the artfully graded curvature would have been ruined. We also get a glimpse of the methods and materials used at Bagan, because like nearly every other monument here, the Nakwi Ndang Stupa is made of bricks, and lots of them, in temporary kilns that were set up next to the construction site and then disassembled later. A single laborer could have produced about 300 bricks per day. Scholars estimate that at the height of construction, all the kilns in Bagan probably could have made about 2 million bricks per day. But all these bricks were intended merely to form the core structure. On top of them was added an additional layer of decorated stucco, most of which has long fallen off. This makes the monuments of Bagan appear more similar today than they once did when unique stucco designs covered their exteriors. Now, one of the great threats to Myanmar's cultural heritage is earthquakes, as the Sagaing Fault runs right through the middle of the country. Bagan has been struck many times in its history, most recently in 1975 and 2016, with structural damage being more severe on those monuments closer to the walled town. The Nakwi Ndang Stupa was no exception. Today, it sports 3 steel rings around its midsection, which were added to stabilize the foundation in the event of another tremor. It was lucky, though. The nearby Bupaya Stupa, one of the oldest structures of Bagan, collapsed completely in 1975 and has since been fully reconstructed. Though it gleams in the sunlight today, it's made of reinforced gilded concrete and thus bears only superficial resemblance to what stood there previously. Now it's time to leave the walled city. Not long after exiting through the Taraba Gate, we arrive at perhaps the most revered temple in all of Bagan. This is the Ananda Temple, named for one of the Buddha's most trusted disciples. The Ananda is built around an enormous central block of stone, with 4 wide entrance halls leading out of the central chambers to create a cruciform shape. From the Western approach, we get a clear glimpse of the decorative program often applied to grand arches. Flame-like vertical spires that culminate at either end with sea creatures known as makara, fantastic beasts drawn from Hindu mythology who often served as guardians of gateways and other portals. Now, before we go inside, let's take a moment to admire some of the striking sculptural work that encircles the exterior. Starting on the western side, down at the base of the temple, are approximately 1,500 glazed green tiles set within square niches. Once again, they depict figures and events associated with the Buddha's famous ordeal at Bodh Gaya. Here, we find endlessly creative images of Mara's huge army of demons in their attempts to entice the Buddha away from his pursuit of enlightenment. At the bottom of each tile is a short caption that describes the scene. A typical inscription repeated on many of these tiles is, "Mara's army with snakes coming from their eyes." But not all the tiles feature an ugly demon. Some depict cute little innocent animals such as a waddling duckling. This was a reminder that Mara's demons could take on many different shapes and hide in the most unsuspecting of places. So don't get complacent with your pursuit of nirvana. Let's enter the temple itself. If you go in through the western entrance hall, you'll be greeted with a large circular stone slab incised with the Buddha's footprint, though it is often obscured by monetary offerings by pilgrims desiring karmic merit. Artistic depictions of the Buddha's footprints appear throughout Asia, but they are particularly popular in Southeast Asia. When I visited Bagan, I made sure to purchase my own woven rendering of the Buddha's footprint from an artist selling his wares in one of the temples. Now, in addition to the stone slab, the western entrance hall, like all the others, also contains evidence that its walls were once covered in continuous painted murals. Apparently covered in white stucco at a later date, scholars have recently begun to chip away at the crusty coating to reveal long-buried images of seated Buddhas and other faint scenes. But your eyes will soon be drawn away, for each hall ends in an inner sanctum with a standing gilded Buddha, though likely of more recent construction, made of solid teak and covered with gold leaf. Buddhist theology divides up time into eons or Bhadrakalpa, each lasting several 100 million years. Only a certain number of Buddhas will appear in each eon, though the texts vary. Some say as few as 5, others as many as several thousands. At Bagan, the more conservative number from the Pali text is adhered to, and the 4 Buddhas you see here are the 4 of our current Bhadrakalpa: Kakusanda, Konagamana, Kassapa, and finally Gautama, who is, of course, usually just known as the Buddha, and the one who achieved enlightenment most recently. We are still waiting for Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, who will be the last of our age. From Ananda, if we continue along the main road to the northeast for 3 miles along the shores of the Irrawaddy River, we'll come eventually to the Shwedagon Stupa complex. In terms of popular reverence, the Shwedagon is on par with the Ananda Temple, and that makes it an excellent place to witness modern-day devotional practices of everyday Burmese. Constructed in the 11th or 12th century, the Shwedagon Stupa complex consists of a walled compound built around a massive gilded stupa in the center. Just like with the Shwedagon Stupa in Yangon, its fame derives from a legend that claims that one of the Buddha's teeth and a forehead bone are stored inside. The dome of the stupa sits on an octagonal terrace that is in turn supported by 3 more square terraces. Each terrace has over 100 niches, with green glazed stone tiles narrating 550 tales from the life of the Buddha as they wind their way up clockwise. Around the base of the stupa are plinths upon which sit potted flowering plants cast from bronze. The entire structure was extensively regilded during the 1980s, so Shwedagon shines out like no other temple at Bagan. Now, in addition to the stupa and its terraces, the Shwedagon complex also contains 4 temples at the base of the stupa, each with a modern gilded metal Buddha inside. There are also many ancillary buildings within the complex, including a shrine in the southeastern corner with 37 statues of gnat spirits inside. Large breezeways radiate outwards to shelter the pilgrims as they make their journey inwards, and these are popular places for hawkers to set up shop and ply their wares. Perhaps the most interactive structure is a cage with a statue of a reclining Buddha on the north side. It is said that if you can stick your arm through the bars and touch the robe of the Buddha, you should expect to return to Bagan within 3 years. Bagan is a truly enormous complex. The UNESCO listing identifies more than 3,500 monuments within the archaeological zone, and some estimate that more than double that once stood on this plain. Though we can't hope to cover them all, there's one last one that we shouldn't miss, located on the far southeastern corner of the Bagan Plains. This is the Dhamma Yazika, a 5-sided stupa found nowhere else in Asia. Its 5 shrines contain 5 Buddha statues, all in a state of great decay: the historical one, his 3 predecessors, and the future Buddha. The Dhamma Yazika contains an astonishing number of bricks. Just how many? Well, no one can count them all, but based on extrapolations from its volume, scholars estimate that a mind-boggling 6 million bricks were used in its construction. Nevertheless, so efficient and industrious were the ancient craftsmen of Bagan that even this monument took only 2 years to construct. But perhaps this is because they had nothing else to do. In a rare historical inscription found at the Dhamma Yazika, we learn that this stupa was built to preserve sacred relics obtained from the king of Sri Lanka. But it also tells us that the king went on to donate an additional 500 bonded Burmese laborers and 500 bonded Indian laborers to tend to the monument. This is one of those unfortunate reminders that Buddhism, despite all its lofty pretensions to spiritual liberation, could still place very real shackles on our worldly bodies. Now, the Dhamma Yazika stupa fell into a state of great decay by the early 20th century, a fate shared by so many of the monuments at Bagan. For reasons still unknown, in the 14th century, the capital was moved east from Bagan to the city of Ava, which is closer to present-day Mandalay. It has been suggested that perhaps Mongol invasions further to the north had something to do with this shift. Regardless, the end result was that hundreds of stupas and temples lost the funding and care of their absentee patrons. In the 19th century, a British traveler observed that, quote, "the greater number have been abandoned to the owls and bats, and some have been desecrated into cow houses by the villagers." In the 1990s, the military government of Myanmar undertook an extensive campaign of renovations. But before and after pictures of some sites show radically different designs. Though everyone agreed that restorations of some sort were urgent, many scholars both at home and abroad criticized the results, which they said did not conform to what was known about the style of decoration in ancient Bagan. One leading historian even went so far as to call these restorations, quote, "blitzkrieg archaeology." UNESCO also expressed its disapproval, rejecting Myanmar's application for Bagan's World Heritage status in 1995. That recognition finally came in 2019, more than 2 decades later. And it reflects a common debate at cultural sites around the world. Namely, how far should the stewards of our collective cultural heritage go in trying to preserve an ideal of authenticity from the distant past? Can we ever truly know what the original appearance of any given structure was? And why aren't the monuments of Bagan allowed to evolve in their relationship with the people and government of Myanmar today, as they often did in earlier eras of history? After all, Burmese kings and queens continued to make pilgrimages to Bagan many centuries after its decline, and they frequently imposed their own significant alterations on its thousands of stupas and temples, sometimes even whitewashing entire walls filled with ancient frescoes. While the Bagan we see today may not be the Bagan of 1,000 years ago, it is the Bagan that millions of Burmese still identify with as exemplifying their ancient religion, culture, and history.